When, as you mentioned, people say, "Oh, Freud is all about sex." They get it the wrong way round, because what is actually the case is that sex is actually about everything.
I guess it's like trails and blazes with the apple getting wrong, sticking labels on lists on. Fake ladies and males get their shit on, made up and murdered like women gliding with their wings gone.
Yo, what's going down? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And it's starting to get warm here in Sydney, my friend. I can feel it. It's in my room. You know how you can tell that it's starting to get warm in Sydney?
Because it's getting warm? Because it feels warm?
It's even worse. It's even worse than that. Like if you're inside all day and you want to know if it's getting warm, all you have to do is just measure the amount of cockroaches that you see.
Ooh.
If there are no cockroaches, it's cold outside and it's winter. If there are a few cockroaches, it's starting to get warmer. And guess what? I saw the first cockroach today, and I saw the first mosquito today. That must mean it's warm outside. God damn.
Yeah, there's some correlation issues there, but, whatever, Australia.
No, dude, it's a causation thing, because in the wintertime, the cockroaches go underground and they hide. But in the summertime, they come up and they go in everywhere. They're everywhere here. It's fucking... And mosquitoes. Mosquitoes don't exist in the wintertime. Like, literally, they are just gone. And then in the summertime, they are everywhere. Ah!
Yeah, I couldn't deal with that, man. I'm never going to Australia. Like, I live in, the most lush part of the United States of America, and I'm still scared of Australia.
Well, at least the weather is nice and sunny and all of that shit, and there's no storms and earthquakes and whatnot. So I'll take the good with the bad. Or I'll take the bad with the good.
What is the go-to natural disaster in Australia, or at least in the part where Sydney is?
Yeah, I mean they can get really bad dust storms here. That's a big one. Really bad, really bad. I mean they do gnarly thunderstorms, so flooding and things like that is an issue. But dust storms are the weird freak things that happen. If you actually Google New South Wales or East Australia dust storms, there's some interesting footage of Sydney where it's just red in the background because there's just dust all over. It's crazy and spooky looking. And then, of course, I'm on the coast where it's less severe than if you even go inward to the desert a little bit more and go westward where it gets really bad. Those towns get ravaged by dust storms. So that's a bad one.
Yeah, give me thunderstorms every day over dust storms.
True that. So, everybody, we've been teasing it for a few weeks. This is finally the most recent patron-chosen... Well, fuck, maybe. Yeah, it has been quite a while. Oh, yeah. I ended up in the hospital, and then that kind of threw things off, and then we couldn't put things together, and then we had to find a right time, and then our guest was in the United States presenting at the Lacan Écrit conference, but we have Isabel Miller on, who is going to talk with us about psychoanalysis, philosophy. She is a scholar of psychoanalysis and philosophy who focuses on Lacan, artificial intelligence, sex, technology, etc., etc. And so we have about an hour-long wonderful conversation with her, everything about the fundamentals of psychoanalysis, going all the way up to some cultural criticism stuff, her work and how she talks about Ghost in the Shell and artificial intelligence and things like that. And then we even talk a little bit about the Bible and do some weird kind of critiques of Paul's theory about the new body, which is fun.
As we do, yeah.
As we do. So stick around for that. That's coming up, of course, after some other shit that we got to get into.
And if you want to support us in tangible ways, you can always go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. There you can get access to several different tiers of supports, and you get some goodies, including the monthly newsletter we send out with extra shitty minutes and sticky leaves, access to bonus episodes which we produce, which involve all sorts of sundry topics like movies and drug trips that Austin's been on, and me reacting in horror at his experiences. It's definitely the kind of content that you need in your life. And then also the ability to contribute to our next patron-sponsored episode, whatever that may be. So go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn to get access to those things.
That is right. So, all right, time for the first segment of the episode. This is the Shitty Minute. This is where one of us gets to rant and rave about something that is pissing us off. Troy has drawn the shitty straw. So, Troy, what's got you down, brother?
So this is kind of a shitty minute that I experience like once every 13 days. And then it's very ephemeral. Like it lasts for 2 seconds and then I'm kind of done with it because it's just so ubiquitous.
Okay.
But it really bothers me and upsets me when people say that art is subjective. Do you like get a little like tinge in your spine when someone says that?
I guess I hadn't noticed it. Maybe. I don't know. I'm going to pay more attention the next time somebody says it.
Because I mean, I know. Usually, when someone says that, it's supposed to be a conversation stopper, right? It's supposed to be we're disagreeing about something related to an artistic object, and so I'm going to stop this disagreement, which is uncomfortable, by saying art is subjective, and then we can move on to the next topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it functions as a conversation stopper. But even if you wanted to take it as a serious conversational element to be discussed, art is literally objects. So literally speaking, art or an artistic object is not subjective because it's not a subject. It's an object. So in that literal sense, in the most possibly literal sense you could take it, art is definitely not subjective. It's literally objects. Now, when someone says art is subjective, what they mean, I think, is your interpretation of the significance of an artistic object is relative to your experience.
Yeah, taste.
In some sense. In matters of taste, there is no dispute. That's the classic like medieval mantra, right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course that's wrong. Because we dispute over it all the time. Right?
That's what art criticism is.
The internet is predicated on that medieval mantra being incorrect. Now, of course, you could just say that the whole internet is wrong, which is probably correct, although not for this reason.
I mean, would you even go so far as to say in matters of taste, there is only dispute?
There must be dispute, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about this, right? Like transcendental argument, there is dispute, therefore all these things happen, right? So
yeah,
no, it's now I'm being tongue in cheek here, but it obviously is correct that there's all these differences over interpretations and over the appreciation of significance of different artistic objects, and that's great. Like we discuss these things because they're fun and we love them and we enjoy the process, right? But it's not purely a matter of like enjoyment based on false pretenses. It's not purely that. There's a lot of that, no doubt, right? The internet is just like filled the brim with dispute over things that aren't real, right? Like fictional entities and whatnot, or fictional significances. But I think the biggest reason why I don't like this art is subjective thing, especially when it functions as a conversation stopper, is because it sort of upholds or posits this binary where either you have to think that there's some absolute, unchanging, eternal significance to every artistic object, or there's nothing, and it's purely about how you personally enjoy the artistic object, and that has no relevance to anybody else. That's what usually they mean by art is subjective. And it's obviously not either of those, I think. I don't think anyone really believes it's either of those, right? It's pluralistic, it's relativistic, it's uncertain. It's not the same thing as like a hard science, right? But artistic appreciation, artistic criticism, and discussion does revolve around the actual nature of the thing and discussing the significance of the thing. And I think it's fine to say, look, here's the thing I appreciate about this artistic object, and then you can disagree with me, both in terms of the matters of the contents of what I'm saying, if you think there's like a problem with the logic of my argument or presentation, and also over whether you think the thing that I think is significant is actually significant and why you think otherwise. And that's fine. And it could come out that neither of us is correct or that we're both correct in different ways. Like that's possible in many different scenarios. And I think that's a lack of appreciation for the multitude of outcomes that can come from an argument and from a disputation and from a discussion. We tend to think in this binary of I'm right and you're wrong, or vice versa. And it does not have to be that way. Discussion is almost never, very rarely ever that way. So we should be more open to the multitude of outcomes that come with discussion, especially when it comes to discussing art, and not have to retreat into this, well, I just have my own subjective experience with the art. You can't criticize that. Like, no, there's some ways in which it's inappropriate to criticize that. But that does not mean that something is not open to criticism because it's quote unquote subjective.
There's another way that the phrase art is subjective is used that I think is the one that I notice more, that makes me feel icky. But it isn't like my skin crawls or that I get angry, but I kind of almost just pause, and I really, and maybe I'm being kind of smug when I do this, but I just ask, I say, is it? But I don't mean that rhetorically, and I don't do it in a way that sounds smug, but I think in my own mind, I'm kind of like, I don't even want to get into this right now because it's just so fucking ubiquitous, and everybody just says this all the time, and it's totally cliche, but I think the person oftentimes is saying it because they're trying to sound more clever than maybe they are, you know? So they take this position of like, well, there are various interpretations of things and we don't really know. So not only is it not, so there's the conversation stopper form, but then there's also this as well, where it's supposedly viewed as like an enlightened position. And that's the one where I'm kind of like, is it? Oh, well, maybe. Yeah. Okay. And then for me, it's a conversation stopper because I just don't want to get into the conversation about that. So they're not stopping the conversation. I'm stopping the conversation.
You should just stop the conversation by saying art is objective and then move on.
No, but you know, I just be like, literally, that's an object, and then walk away.
I think the point you bring up is really good. We've talked a lot about epistemic humility on this podcast, right? The person who says art is subjective as a way of deflating all the claims that the other person has made or that anybody in the discussion has made is the one who's being most epistemically arrogant. They're saying this whole mode of discourse elicits no true statements or false statements. It's just kind of meaninglessness, right? Like you're saying about an entire mode of discourse, which many people spend the majority of their lives engaging in, elicits no true or false statements. Like that's an incredibly strong claim to make, right? Which you need lots of support to make that. Given, I think the sort of the burden of proof lies on that person who says that, right? And instead, we should just be more open and say, you know what? I'm not sure exactly how matters of taste correspond to, like true and false statements, like in the indicative mode or whatever. But I'm open to it, and I know that I care a lot about it. So let's actually engage in the discussion and see where it goes. I'm open to the idea that we might come to certain things that are true, or that are marginally true, that are possibly true, or that are multiply true. And be open to that. Be epistemically, humble and open to the possibilities of knowledge here, rather than having some dogmatic claim about what's true and what can be true and what can't be true from the outset.
The great irony here is that the statement art is subjective is meant to be non-dogmatic, but it actually ends up being metaphysical.
Super dogmatic. Like even more dogmatic than the art is objective thing, I think.
And I think it's partly because, one, people are afraid of dogmatism. We live in a post-religious world where anything except for science that makes declarative statements must be viewed with suspicion, especially in the humanities or arts, right? But I think people are really afraid of debate, right? And I know that debate doesn't always feel good, because if you have a really strongly held opinion and somebody disagrees with it and you have cathectically imbued yourself into that position, then it feels like you yourself are somehow being smacked down. So this is one way of us kind of protecting ourselves. It's almost like a neurosis where we protect ourselves so that we don't actually allow our attachments to our opinions to be known publicly. So we just kind of like, art is subjective. Let's not get into it. Let's not debate, because if we get into a debate, then someone's feelings are going to get hurt, or then my vulnerabilities are going to be revealed as you realize that I'm attached to this thing and you smack me down, and then I'm going to get angry, and then I'm going to be out of control, and then you're going to see that I'm some weird freak or something. So it seems that there's also this weird anxiety that's underpinning this position as well. So it's like metaphysical, and it's anxious, and it's dogmatic.
Yeah, and there's good reason to have that anxiety. There's a long tradition of arrogant, dumbass men who want nothing more than to just pounce on someone and make them feel bad for thinking something. And that's stupid and horrible, and you're right to sort of have disdain for that, right? But the response to that should be to celebrate the idea of discussion more than debate in that narrow sense that we're talking about. Because discussion is open to truth and open to knowledge and open to being corrected and encouraged and amended and everything, and doesn't have to tie, belief to personal ideology or whatever. So, there's different modes to respond than just to like retreat into our corners and sort of run away from the idea of discussion.
Would you rather live in a world where there's an authoritarian church and an authoritarian state, or where there's just a million little authoritarian, like, patriarchal dudes?
You mean like a feudalistic?
Well,
type
just,
society?
like, there's no central state, everything's decentralized, you've got democracy, but the epistemological discourse is run by, like, patriarchal dudes. But you don't have an authoritarian church anymore.
I don't know. This seems too ambiguous for me to decide. What were you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking of the distinction that Zizek makes, kind of, between, like, he'd rather have the central authoritarian, or like the authoritarian father, than the liberal father. But that's too kind of like the liberal father's too nice for the example. But I'm thinking, like, you're talking about, there's like a history of dudes that have kind of taken this position where they've, like, smacked people down and they've engaged in, let's say, a position of dominance, right? And I wonder, like, is that a sort of post-authoritarian form of, like, individual authoritarianism? So rather than having a state or a church that is like, everyone must go on Sundays and all of society must be structured according to, like, theocratic principles or whatever, and then you don't have so that's like a church authoritarianism, and then you don't have an authoritarian state where it's, like, repressive and stuff like that, but what you just have are just, like, a bunch of mini despots running around, but they're all operating under the auspices of democracy or something. I don't know why I thought about this. This makes no sense. I'd rather have neither, I'd rather have neither, but I feel like that the latter is actually worse. That if you had a central authoritarian church and a state, then even though it's a centralized power with a lot of concentrated power, at least it isn't dispersed and they're not fucking everywhere, that becomes like a subject position that anyone can occupy insofar as you just are like a dude, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, in one sense, I can see why it would be worse just because it's inauthentic. But also, it seems easier to change the latter than the former. Like, how do you take on an authoritarian state and church? Like, maybe over hundreds of years you could reform it, but instantaneously. Whereas you could probably, like, seek to change individual authoritarian, patriarchs or whatever. And maybe not. Maybe that actually makes it harder since it's so dispersed. I don't know.
I don't know either. Totally
yeah,
random.
How about we just try to build a better society?
Yeah, let's do that.
Where we can talk about art and not hate each other for it.
Yes, please.
That said, if you like Five Finger Death Punch, like, go fuck yourself.
All right, cool. So now we're going to jump into our main segment. As we said at the top of the show, we have a guest on, and this is the fulfillment of the patron-chosen topic, the philosophy of psychoanalysis. Y'all chose it, so y'all get it, and we called on an expert to come in and chat with us. This is Isabel Miller, not Millar. Don't say Millar. Even if you do your homework, you will get it wrong. It is Isabel Miller who is on the show. She is a scholar of psychoanalysis and philosophy who specializes in Lacan, AI, sex, and technology. Hello, Isabel.
Hello. I'm so glad that you took so much care and effort to pronounce my name, even though now you're going to confuse people because they're going to think my name's Miller when it's actually Millar, but not Millar. Oh. So now we're just all confused. No, I'm joking. No, it's perfect.
You're such an asshole. You're such an asshole. Now I was like, this was a setup. Yeah.
I know. I just thought I'd see how the American pronounces it and then laugh. No,
well,
fine.
The thing that's ridiculous is this was a conference, too. I think it was, I don't know, you were given some paper, and it was someone that was like, we just want to welcome her back. We love her here, blah, blah, blah. Isabel Millar. So I figured they knew you and that they already had your name down. And I was like, and they still said Millar.
The bastards, yeah. They're just probably just trying to make me feel good. Anyway, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well, cool. So philosophy of psychoanalysis is the topic. I have no idea why our patrons chose this topic. Maybe it's their own sort of perversion that they want to work through. So I guess the first thing is, since your work is at the intersection of philosophy and psychoanalysis, can you explain how it is that you bridge those two together?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting formulation to say the philosophy of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis is itself a sort of, a challenge to psychoanalysis is a challenge to philosophy in a sense, given that the Freudian discovery of the unconscious was where Lacan started off his sort of lifelong engagement with philosophy. So in a sense, there isn't a philosophy of psychoanalysis any more than there is a psychoanalysis of philosophy, but the two are very interlinked in a very important way that has got epistemological and ontological roots. And they all start off with, I suppose, the question of the unconscious.
Do you think that could you say that psychoanalysis is a type of meta-philosophy even?
Well, again, this is a really complex question because some people would say that's what it is. What Lacan said about his practice in the 1970s was that it was an anti-philosophy. And this term actually referred to the kind of reaction against the sort of hyper-rationalism in the sort of end of the 17th century, and was something associated with religious movements to kind of counter this stream in French thought. So when Lacan calls himself an anti-philosopher, it's a very provocative thing to do, given that supposedly he's in the tradition of Enlightenment thought, growing out of the Freudian tradition as well. So people found it very strange that he would decide to call himself an anti-philosopher, given that most of his work had grown out of engaging with philosophy. But that term has a very specific meaning. And I think I may be jumping too far ahead to get into what he meant by that yet. So if we want to, I don't know, go in some other direction before we get into that particular question.
Well, we should add also, there's a long history in philosophy of anti-philosophers who then later on become codified as philosophers, right?
Yes.
Nietzsche being the obvious example,
Spinoza.
right? And then all throughout history.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
people who question the sort of guiding dogma of the time are doing philosophy, even though because they're against the guiding dogma, it's considered anti-philosophy.
Exactly. So when Lacan talks about philosophy, what he has in mind is specifically a pre-modern understanding of philosophy, which he associates with the sort of Parmenidean kind of homologization between being and thinking, which for him, after Freud specifically, you can no longer put together because being and thinking for Lacan are not the same thing. So of course he goes through this. He goes about this via various different twists and turns and engaging with, for example, the astronomy of Kepler, Newtonian physics, and the Cartesian method of radical doubt. All these are very important pillars in his articulation of what for him philosophy was, and for what psychoanalysis is as a science of the subject has to do with philosophy as a different mode of thought, a different discourse.
If there were two or three or a handful of, I guess, elements that define Lacan breaking from Freud, I mean, I think people have very particular characterizations, maybe even caricatures in their mind of what they think of Freud, that Freud was sex obsessed, that he thinks that everyone just wants to fuck their mom, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
What do you think Lacan is doing, breaking from both, maybe the caricature, but also just breaking from Freudian psychoanalysis, like depth in relation to topology, that kind of thing, the unconscious as being structured like a language. What are the things that are central to Lacanian psychoanalysis that distinguish it from Freudian psychoanalysis?
Well, first of all, I mean, Lacan actually wants to return to Freud. He doesn't want to depart from Freud in that sense, because what motivated him was the misappropriation of Freud as he saw it, and the way that.
And this real quick, if I can do this, is an historical concern, right? Because this is at a time when Freud was a little bit in disrepute. Yes, so his return to Freud is kind of an historical maneuver, right?
Well, kind of, but more that because for Lacan, what was missed was that Freud's radical contribution to not just clinical practice, but to the theory of psychoanalysis and his ontological discovery was missed by the post-Freudians, who tried to kind of erase all of these radical questions and take Freud for something a little bit more akin to sort of cognitive psychologist, and lose the radicality of what he was saying about sex. When as you mentioned, people say, oh, Freud is all about sex. They get it the wrong way round, because what is actually the case is that sex is actually about everything. But not when I say sex, I don't mean sex as in a sort of substantialized thing that we do between people. I mean that there is a concept that Freud discovered pertaining to sex, which he was very was very peculiarly able to articulate in a way that nobody else had before. And this is what he discovered through his method of psychoanalysis, is that sex is not a thing, but it's actually an absence of a thing.
Is that the difference between the mischaracterization of Freud being that everything is sex, whereas if you reverse that and say no, sex is everything, that has a different meaning, different connotation?
It has an absolutely different meaning, yes, because if you say, oh, well, everything's about sex, it sounds like we're saying, everything that you ever do has some underlying sexual meaning, that you actually, when you're talking to somebody, what you're really thinking about is this, and actually what you want to do is that. And that's a kind of very superficial and erroneous way of understanding the question, because actually what he was trying to say was that there is an impasse of meaning which is sexual, and sexuality itself results from an impasse of meaning, and this impasse of meaning is a certain gap in knowledge, a missing piece of knowledge, which we call the unconscious, which Freud would have called the unconscious. So this concept is something which, before you even try and talk about sex in psychoanalysis, you have to go very, very far back to talking about the modes of negation and repression and foreclosure and perversion, and all these different concepts that relate to what we could even possibly mean when we're talking about sex in the first place. So there are so many layers to get to sex, that yes, it is all about sex, but sex isn't what you think it is.
Why sex and not, I don't know, reciprocity, exchange, I don't know, other forms of communication, things like that? What is it about the signifier? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, sex isn't. Sex is the opposite of a reciprocity. Certainly for Lacan, sex was a non-rapport, a non-relation, and it's something that relates to modes of enjoyment that the subject can achieve. And these modes of enjoyment are dependent on your particular sexuation, of whether it's a masculine or a feminine sexuation, which doesn't accord to your biological makeup, but rather to your inclination towards enjoyment. And so these modes are not forms of reciprocity. They're forms of non-relation. They are impasses. They are things that don't make sense. So they're not.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. No. I was going to say this is really interesting too, because so one of the things I get into a lot of conversations with people, especially when I do like film criticism, film analysis. I recently watched the film Antichrist on a popular podcast called Show Me the Meaning by Wisecrack, which is, a lot of people that listen to this podcast know us from that. Mm-hmm. And we were having this conversation about how there's a clear sort of like hysteric female sexual position that is played by Charlotte Gainsbourg character, and then of course you have like the obsessive that is the psychologist, the actual therapist that is played by Willem Dafoe's character, right? And they're like intentionally named man and woman, and they go to Eden because there's kind of like retelling of the garden myth, yada yada yada. But I was having this conversation, and one of the women that was engaging in a conversation with us had a real problem with this idea that these characters were sexualized, that they were stuck within a gender role, that this was man and that this was woman. You know, woman as the hysteric, which is a position that has been kind of placed upon females to discredit them for decades and decades and decades, right? And then the man is the rational, calculating analyst therapist, and she didn't like that. And I was trying to explain that no, the notion for Lacan is that sexuation is like a structural or societal position that any body can operate within. As a matter of fact, you can move between them in an instant, in a moment. For the Deleuzians out there, and Isabel briefly and we chatted about Deleuze a minute ago, but they operate at varying degrees of intensity and variation, we might say, even in the same moments. So can you explain that a little bit in non-Deleuzian wanky terms for listeners?
I think you put it very well, exactly. I mean, this is one controversial thing that's always been a controversial thing in Lacan's thought, is that people often misunderstand the question of sexuation, and that when he's talking about male and female sexuation as being logical formulations, people too quickly assume he's saying something that there's some sort of hyperstatizing thing that makes you, if you're a woman, you're this, and if you're a man, you're this, which is exactly the opposite of what Lacan has in mind. I mean, when he's formalizing the question of sexuation with lots of funny symbols, what he's actually trying to do is make it so far removed from anything to do with what your body is doing, which is completely liberating and totally feminist, and actually the most transgender feminist friendly theory that you could possibly imagine. So the idea that Lacan was in any way anti-women or anti-gay or anti-trans or anti is just complete nonsense. So the thing is that he is very much saying that anybody at any time can occupy any position on that spectrum. What he does say, though, what's very clear, is that for him, masculinity is subsumed by femininity. So if anything, he's basically advocating everyone should be a lot more feminine than masculine, because it's a position which allows for so much more than the masculine position. In that sense,
it's the. I was going to say that it's the men's rights activists that should really have a problem with, like, not the feminists.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is this a symptom of Western capitalism? Is this a symptom of Western post-Enlightenment? Or is this a universal human symptom? Like this division, this bifurcation of these logical and structural positions that you can occupy as sexuated positions, are these things results of particular, let's say, even more like a larger logic? Like, are they Western symptoms, or do these things apply to all cultures around the world?
That's a good question, but I would say no. They're specifically by their nature, they are onto-epistemological symptoms, which are inescapable, and they structure the very nature of subjectivity itself. So I wouldn't say that they're particular to Western culture, even though different manifestations of masculinity or femininity can appear in any given culture to be differently emphasized. But the antagonism and the question of sexual difference is something that goes far beyond cultural manifestations of sexual difference, and that has much more to do with our mode of becoming subjects that we can't possibly overcome. Even that doesn't mean to say that one cannot occupy a position of being a trans person, for example, or being a gender non-conforming person, or being queer, or any of these questions. So this is not to say that to erase the idea of somebody who doesn't identify as masculine or feminine, but the idea of the logic of masculinity and femininity is a question for Lacan that has to do with a more conceptual understanding of what subjectivity is in itself.
Troy and I did a bonus episode on Black Mirror's Striking Vipers. Did you see Striking Vipers?
I haven't watched it yet. I haven't got around to it.
Okay, I feel like you have to see this because I feel like this would fit perfectly into this, yeah? Because that's kind of, these players that are playing a video game, they embody the avatar of these characters, and then they end up having sex through their avatars, but it's these two dudes that have a heterosexual relationship through the avatars. But then is it homoerotic? Is there a homosociality thing that's going, like what exactly is going on here? And so it's been a really interesting cultural artifact for people to analyze, especially from like the trans perspective, you know?
Yeah. No, that sounds interesting. I need to watch that, yeah.
Because you've written on Black Mirror before, right?
Yes, yeah. I have. I think that particularly I wrote about an episode called Archangel, which is to do with having a chip implanted in your head.
What were you talking about in that piece primarily?
Well, this the reason I was interested in this particular episode is because the little girl in it, she gets implanted with a sort of a homing device by her mother to keep her safe. So she basically is watched at all hours of the day from a remote device from her mother's kind of handset, so that her mum can kind of make sure that she's safe. But of course, as the years go by, her mum has to sort of adjust the privacy levels in her child's kind of monitoring device, because she doesn't want to be an overbearing mother, but at the same time she is worried about her having sex or taking drugs or whatsoever. And of course what ends up happening is that the mother does become an overbearing force for her, because she tries to interfere with her life, and it ends up very gruesomely with the child murdering her mother and smashing her over the head with her monitoring device. And of course, it's horrific and it's gruesome. But it's very good as a sort of illustration of a sort of clinical idea, which is very fundamental to Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is of course the question of the mother's desire and the entrance of the name of the father as the law-giving presence. And when Lacan says name of the father, he doesn't actually mean father, but it's a metaphor for a system, a symbolic system, which would separate the child from the all-encompassing and overwhelming and enigmatic desire of the mother, who is at once the source of all love and comfort and warmth, but also a source of mystery and strangeness, because the mother also wants something else other than the child. So this dialectic between the mother and the child, and how much the mum wants from the child and how much the child gets from the mother, is the kind of basis through which psychoanalytic structure is formed according to how the child navigates this process. And this is what is called, obviously in Freudian terms, the Oedipal complex, and ultimately what the way the child navigates this is via castration, right? So in this Black Mirror, what you get is a kind of really futuristic way of talking about the navigation of the Oedipal complex and the castration of it, but via technology. And ultimately the child goes mad because the mother is literally in her head all the time and controls her desire, and it drives her mad. So it's a quite nice way of kind of talking about this dynamic in ways that break free of the sort of Freudian dynamic of mother and father and child.
And the important thing for Lacan, if I remember correctly, and you can kind of expand on this, Isabel, is that these categories of name of the father and the Oedipal complex and whatnot, these are structural categories, not necessarily referring to specific material realities, right?
Exactly. So they don't have to correspond to any sort of traditional family structures or male or female ideas of what a parent is or what a mother is or what a father is. They're structural questions for Lacan always, yeah.
Real quick, I think it might be useful to explain the difference between Lacan and Freud on the question of the unconscious or on the concept of the unconscious, right? Can you just kind of talk about like what was, because I think most people think for, Freud, there was like this depth, there was this truth that's like hidden inside of yourself. And then deep down in there's the deep, dark desires, and they come out with Freudian slips and things like that. And that's the really real kind of emerging and popping up and saying, hi, here I am. And then for Lacan,
it's the iceberg metaphor you always see.
The iceberg, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
Well. So actually, for Lacan, the question of the unconscious changes throughout his teaching, and the most familiar way of talking about Lacan's idea of the unconscious is from his early work, which people often say is the unconscious is the discourse of the other, or the unconscious is structured like a language, or the unconscious is a bit later, the unconscious is the other's desire. So these are all ways of externalizing the unconscious as something which is not this sort of substance, this depth that is hidden inside and you have to sort of uncover it, but rather that it's outside the subject, which exists outside the subject by virtue of the subject entering into a shared symbolic universe, which they're not in control of, because we're just born into this world and we have to deal with whatever structures are already here. So in that sense, the unconscious was structural for Lacan at the beginning because it's to do with things that we don't control, that are the laws of our societies, which we have to basically kind of muscle into and fit into as best as we can. But later on, his ways of talking about the unconscious do change, and of course, towards the end of his seminar, he starts talking about the speaking body, or the speaking being first he called it, and then he calls it the speaking body. And in fact, the contemporary clinic, Jacqueline Millet's contemporary clinic, will talk about the par l'être, the speaking body, as the unconscious, as today's unconscious. So they don't really generally would use that word anymore. I mean, they do, but it's the speaking body is the thing that the clinic works with.
Okay. All right. So let's do a big transition here, and let's start talking about the value of psychoanalysis as a cultural tool, or in cultural criticism. So how does it work? I mean, particularly, you can talk about your work. You focus especially on artificial intelligence and sex and technology. So how are you using your work to critique culture, society, etc.?
Well, first of all, just on a general basis, I would say that Lacanian psychoanalysis is, to me, essential for any worthwhile cultural criticism, because I think it's really essential to have a conception of the Lacanian subject and the mode of enjoyment of any speaking being, if you want to put it in Lacanian terms, when analysing any cultural phenomena or political formation, because otherwise you end up falling into when I say psychoanalysis, I suppose I'm distinguishing it from a sort of psychologizing mode of interpretation that I suppose is what you're comparing it to if we talk about how people try and understand humans based on psychological data, which, as we know, is not a very useful way of talking about humans. Then you end up with Jordan Peterson.
You know what's funny? You're talking about psychologizing people. Immediately my mind went to Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
motherfucker,
exactly.
Why is he always haunting my fucking mind?
Exactly. That's why we need to erase him. But no, I mean, because the thing is, psychoanalysis is the most rigorous and far-ranging and complex theory of subjectivity that exists. I challenge anyone to find a thinker who's done more and engaged more with different modes of thinking to radicalize the question of subjectivity than Lacan. And therefore, I think that he is a brilliant tool still, and will continue to be so, to talk about politics and to talk about sex and to talk about culture and film. So basically, I think Yeah, so that's just a kind of general value of Lacanian psychoanalysis as far as I'm concerned. But in terms of my own particular research area, which is the question of the relationship between sex and artificial intelligence, which I approach from the Lacanian standpoint, the reason I'm interested in it is because I think that specifically the question of AI challenges notions of subjectivity and challenges Lacanian concepts in a way that I find really interesting. And I think Lacanian concepts can also get inside different philosophical ideas about artificial intelligence in a really exciting and interesting way, and sort of push Lacan a bit further. That's my particular interest in it, because I think it can do even more with Lacan than's been done before.
Which Lacanian concepts does AI tend to challenge?
Well, I mean, lots of them, but I think particularly the question of the subject and the question of enjoyment is one that through AI we can sort of start to think about it in new ways. So that's why, I mean, like, you'll probably have seen, I don't know, from stuff that, you know, my work is associated with talking about sex robots a lot. But actually, whilst I am interested in sex robots, it's not particularly because of the kind of sensational idea of a robot that you can have sex with. It's more the conceptual idea of what an automated artificial intelligence means for sex, the concept of sex psychoanalytically. And so that's why I think that it's like a sort of meeting point where between psychoanalysis and philosophy, where you get AI with this weird, strange hybrid.
Can we just pause for a minute and talk about enjoyment?
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, especially to try to clarify it for people listening, when we hear the word enjoyment in everyday use, it generally relates to feeling good or being happy or some measure of stimulus and input that releases dopamine or whatever the fuck else it is, right? Mm-hmm. And we're enjoying ourselves in an activity. You go to a fair, you go to a good film. I'm enjoying myself, whatever that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not exactly how you're using the word.
No. No, so enjoyment, or, well, jouissance for Lacan is a central concept, and probably one of the most important concepts of all of psychoanalysis. And it doesn't actually, it can mean feeling good and feeling nice, but that's one small part of the story. It's actually a very strange, paradoxical concept, which is both pleasure and pain. But also, throughout the course of Lacan's teaching, the question of jouissance changes its meaning. First of all, if we just think about the jouissance as in how much one enjoys in one's own suffering, that's a very obvious way of understanding. Oh, okay, so enjoyment isn't really just about, oh, I'm having a nice cake, or I'm having sex, or whatever whatever type of enjoyment you're having. It's to do with how you're engaged with the world. So we all recognize very, very easily the question of people enjoying their own suffering, or even ourselves enjoying our own suffering, even, you know, crying or thinking about something, and there is some sort of strange thing that you keep repeating and keep going back to that gives you some enjoyment. So this question of enjoyment is a really, really difficult one, because it's very difficult to describe or to place in one idea. And in fact, Jacques-Alain Miller has 6 paradigms of enjoyment that he would align to 6 different moments in Lacan's teaching, which correspond to very different models of what enjoyment could possibly mean.
So I'm just scribbling down as you're talking here, and the way you were describing jouissance here, for whatever reason, and tell me if these concepts in the history of philosophy have any relation to the things that Lacan is working through and maybe from which he's seeking to distance himself. But I wrote down conatus, and I'm thinking about Spinoza. Then I wrote down will to power, and I'm thinking about Nietzsche. And then I wrote down vital impulse or élan vital, and I'm thinking about Henri Bergson. And then I circled pleasure principle. And then obviously that's Freud. Is this like a lineage out of which he's developing this term, but then from which he's distancing himself?
And you can throw in Aristotle's eudaimonia as well, right?
I mean, I don't know how far he would say that he was developing it from, well, any of those particular thinkers. Of course, you know, from Freud, definitely he takes the idea of the pleasure principle, and then the death drive basically becomes jouissance. So at one point you could say the death drive is jouissance for Lacan.
Oh, okay.
And actually, I would even say that jouissance is the most accurate way of summing up jouissance would be to call it the death drive, because it's this particular concept which actually takes the human outside of the biological model and outside of the rational model, and it's a much more useful way of understanding human behavior. If you think about the death drive, most of the things that we do are motivated by things that are not necessarily good for us. They don't necessarily preserve our well-being or our mental health or our bodily health, but usually they're to do with something outside of that, which is actually related to the death drive.
So basically the internet is a giant death drive machine.
Yeah, basically you could call it that.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. It's a shared networked field of jouissance.
Yes, but you know, like so Miller has his 6 paradigms, which are the imaginarization, signification, impossible jouissance, normal jouissance, discursive jouissance, the non-rapport. These are 6 different paradigms supposedly that relate to different moments in Lacan's teaching and have very different characteristics. And so therefore it's difficult to say, oh, jouissance only means this in Lacan, because depending on what you're reading, it will mean something else.
I mean, I think it would be great. I want to tie this now into kind of some of the stuff that you've done on AI and sex robots. Particularly, you sent an article over on kind of analyzing the film Ghost in the Shell that I thought was really interesting, that will relate to how we understand enjoyment, jouissance, and AI and stuff. But real quick, I got a question. How do you deal with the fact that someone like Lacan has these 6 different paradigms or these moments of developing thought? You know, people are like, well, in Seminar 7, it's this, but then in Seminar 16, it's this, you know? So like, what is it? The signifier of the father becomes the master signifier because he wants to like degenderize it or something like that, right? Later on. So how do you view I mean, do you kind of think that we can take those 6 paradigms in thought and that they're still all relevant for us now when we're doing cultural criticism? Or do you think that we ought to kind of follow along in his own development of thought and then take the later stuff as being more authoritative, or the early stuff? Like, how does that work?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't know, like, I mean, I think pretty much what the general thing that people tend to do with Lacan is just to use the question of jouissance as a sort of blanket term, that kind of a coverall term that would explain any kind of mode of behavior in cultural criticism, for example. But in the clinic, of course, it has, you know, it would be different, and I can't speak for that, But I mean, look, with the question of, if we think of Zizekian cultural criticism, right, and the object A, and what is most characteristic of Zizek's work is you know the capitalist critique, so that the object is just this kind of ubiquitous thing that is the object cause of desire, which we're all chasing after, we can never really have, and it's just this impossible object, which is one way of talking about jouissance, and the kind of very well-known way of thinking about Lacan as a theorist of lack, as something that we can never really have and we always want. But I think that there are more interesting ways to use the question of jouissance, and certainly now in respect to having to deal with new formations, new political formations, new terrifying developments in the far right, and of course with the digital world, all these different modes of enjoyment that are happening online, which it's not maybe as useful just to talk about the object A or something anymore. I don't think that that's maybe the most useful tool that we have. Yeah,
I think that's probably a good way to transition into the article on the Imagining the Apocalypse, or Apocalypse of Sex. So you mentioned, Austin, a second ago, the movie The Ghost in the Shell, or Ghost in the Shell, and I'm familiar with this film, and I've had some friends that were really into the television series or the manga or whatever else existed before the big Americanized version of it. So we'll be good Jajekians, and even though I haven't seen the film, we can talk about analyzing it. So it's about the movie revolves around a kind of, I guess it's not really a sex robot as much as it is a woman who becomes like cyborgicized, or whatever the term is for becoming a cyborg. How do you relate that to this idea of the sex robot that you're analyzing?
So, well, in that particular paper, I'm talking about, first of all, Lacan's reading of Kant with the Marquis de Sade. So, first of all, it's a kind of preempting the question of I suppose, a sex robot ethics, in that paper where I talk about how Lacan reads the Enlightenment, idea of ethics from Kant via the libertine novelist Marquis de Sade's own brutal and sadistic mode of talking about ethics. So what Lacan does, instead of reading Kant as a Sardian, he reads Sade as a Kantian. So in Sade's horrific detailing of the kind of torture that he inflicts upon this young girl in Philosophy in the Boudoir, amongst many other novels that he wrote, he finds a very particular structure of ethics that he says is even more Kantian than Kant's ethical system. And what he's trying to say is that actually there is an inconsistency in the Kantian system that Sade completes with his own way of relating to enjoyment and the way that the law structures our enjoyment. So that in going to the end and in following your absolute enjoyment at the expense of someone else, Sade's system is a much more perfect philosophical system of ethics than Kant's system, even though what results from it is something truly horrific. But the point being is that Sade's libertines, they were interested in the death drive that we've just been talking about. They were interested in this second death that is beyond castration. So the idea that you can infinitely enjoy something and that you can infinitely kill something, or that you could infinitely be killed. But it's something that humans can never really experience, because we always have a biological cycle that brings us back from pleasure to pain. You know, we can't actually be, when they're talking about in Philosophy in the Boudoir, these like perpetual erections and, these sort of piles of bodies like doing all these kinds of weird obscenities. They can't actually happen in reality, because humans can't do that. So the problem was for the Sardian libertines, that they were always thwarted in their pursuit of jouissance, right? So this is a kind of undead enjoyment. It's a kind of robotic, artificial, non-human enjoyment. So that is a long way round to introducing the question of the sex robot. And so for me, this question of the sex robot is what inhabits the fantasies of Sade's libertines. So basically, they want to be sex robots. They don't just want to have a sex robot, they want to be a sex robot, right? So that hence why I use the example of the film Ghost in the Shell, which is not a film about sex, actually. In fact, there is no sex in the film at all. But why it's relevant, why it's interesting, is because the character of Major Killian, she is her brain supposedly is uploaded into a cybernetic body, so she is basically immortal in a sense, but yet her subject position is the same. So even though she supposedly got new memories, she's a different person, she still retains this indelible kind of fault line, this indelible stain in reality that no matter what she thinks, her sort of positive substantialized content of her thought, it doesn't erase the fact that she feels there is something gone and missing and lacking, so she's always searching for her mother, right? So this kind of like question of the subject in relation to the artificial body and its capacity for pleasure and pain is, to me, very relevant to the question of the enjoyment as exposed by the libertines, which is a question of the subject's ability to persist beyond the body and to endure. And what you find in this story is that ultimately she kind of, all of her pleasure and pain is related back to her mother, and whether she can exist with her new mother or go back to her old mother is very interesting if you read it alongside Philosophy in the Boudoir, which has an extremely gruesome end for her because she ends up, the girl in it, sorry to talk about explicit things, but she has the ultimate fantasy for her is the rape and murder of her own mother, supposedly in this book. So it's a completely horrific idea of what this woman's notion of jouissance is. But what's significant about it is that it's to do with the question of rewriting somebody's enjoyment. Because in the Philosophy in the Boudoir, the central character, while she's having these fantasies, these gruesome fantasies that in the end they end up fulfilling, she's being reprogrammed by a new mother, Madame de Saint-Ange, who is basically facilitating her escape from her from her old mode of enjoyment. And in the same way we can see with the Ghost in the Shell, her old body only allows her to live in one way, and her new body allows her to be a weapon, like a fighting machine that can go beyond and live forever. So this is the question that I was interested in that particular essay.
Okay, bear with me. I'm going to say something crazy, and this might not mean anything to you, Isabel, but Troy, and so I'm doing a read through of the Bible at the moment. Both Troy and I have like theological training in the past. So you're talking about the idea of being thwarted in jouissance. That's what these libertines, they're seeking, like, let's say, perpetual, endless jouissance, which it seems to be that they're thwarted potentially in their pursuit of the infinitude, right? They want the perpetual taste of jouissance, which would be the absolute access of infinity. And then you talk about this, now applying this to Ghost in the Shell, or this new body. Troy, I'm thinking about the desire of like Christians to reclaim the new body and the new heaven as being like the realization of this kind of Ghost in the Shell kind of thing. Do you see what I'm...
I literally wrote this down after reading Isabel's article. Yeah, that's crazy.
Holy shit.
Yeah, there's an analogy with like resurrected life as Paul talks about it, right? The perfected body that escapes the tormented cycle that he talks about in like Romans 7 of being like the conflict of different desires and wants and feeling like you're not united. Like that there's this grasping for that in the future, this resurrected life. And it does seem like that's recapitulated in forms of posthumanism and cyborg existence and stuff like that.
Which seems to me a desire to overcome the effects of the quote-unquote fall, which I think that we can read the fall as a psychoanalytic story of desire and longing, where the human subjective position stands between infinitude, that is pure jouissance, and finitude, that is the fact that we are always thwarted from the realization of jouissance. Yes,
exactly. And you're absolutely right that the sort of the biblical myth of the fall is a sort of dramatization of this very question about the sin of knowledge, because actually the Adam and Eve story is not about the sin of sex, it's about the sin of knowledge. So it's in the knowing is when the humans become fall from grace, right? So this very much describes the sort of the psychoanalytic relationship between sex and knowledge, in that they're completely and utterly tied to one question. So that in kind of in it structurally, once you know something, you become human and doomed and sinful and rotten and enter into the cycles of sex reproduction and the biological and the question of mortality, which is what Christianity wants to escape from, basically.
Yeah, this is I've been trying to figure out how to fit this into my current research at the moment, which is based on like market speculation and things like that. But I've been thinking a lot about the algorithm, right? A lot of people are writing about the algorithm at the moment. And I'm thinking about the algorithm as being a type of obsessive desire to thwart castration, right? That it is the potential purveyor of all knowledge, that it can overcome and analyze and predict and mitigate all uncertainty just so long as we have the appropriate linear algebraic equation. If we just have enough inputs, then the pursuit of algebraic and algorithmic perfection via machine learning and artificial intelligence is that thing that is potentially going to overcome our finitude to reach jouissance. Is that kind of what you're working on?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely part of it, and I think that the question of the singularity, of course, is very interesting, because it, in a way, it's almost a sort of pre-modern conception of philosophy. It's precisely the one that Lacan was against, which is this kind of equation of being and thinking as being the same thing. So the idea that you can just create thinking through algorithms, that you can create beings through equations and formulas, is a very curious one. But at the same time, I'm not so sure that it's not possible. So I mean, the Blue Brain project, for example, which is happening in Lausanne. I don't know if you know about that, but
I don't.
Well, they are recreating simulations of the brain, growing over and ever, and gathering more and more data in order to model brain states to gather information. But essentially, it's a silicone version of the brain, which, in theory, they're just modeling the brain on a non-biological substrate. So there is no reason actually why it couldn't become a proper brain. we just don't necessarily have the actual data to do it, the technology to do it yet. But so there's that aspect of it, but there's also the question of like Neuralink, for example, with what's his face, Elon Musk, developing these interfaces that go directly into the brain and merge the biological synaptic systems with microchips, and supposedly that research is going off, and they're applying for permission to use humans subjects for it at the moment. I mean, at the moment they've only got like monkeys and rats, I think, or something. But what will happen? People are going to put their name down for it. Lord knows what will happen once there will be sort of non-biological chips inserted into the brain. I mean, this is a question that I think that psychoanalysis has to grapple with, because we're not just dealing anymore with humans and their symptoms. That it doesn't mean... Sorry, go on.
No, do you not think that there's a pathology in this, that the pathology of the algorithm, that, like, I'm thinking about it in terms of just like market speculation, the pathology of like efficient markets, and as long as we just get enough information, then we'll never have market crises, and then we can just have the capitalist system perpetually, get hyper profits and super profits and whatnot, because we'll have the perfect algorithms. But it seems to me to tie into something even maybe more fundamental than that, which is like a type of pathology of youth, which fits into this pathology of the infinite, because it's a pathology that resists the negative. It resists cessation. It resists the end. And it is essentially negentropic. And so it seems to be that even the desire for seeking this algorithmic dominance is itself kind of a strange and weird perversion.
Yeah. I mean, the quest for eternal youth, and the quest for the perfected human form, and the quest for absolute knowledge I don't know, are they pathologies? I don't know. I mean, aren't they just what humans always have tried to do? I don't know if there is any other way of being human than trying to always get beyond yourself and think that you can sort of triumph beyond that. I mean, that was what Freud was talking about with the prosthetic god, really. It's a sort of like constant urge to go beyond your partial drives, which you can't ever really achieve, but you're always going to try because that's what makes you human.
Yeah, in a weird way, if we could say that the biblical articulation and then let's say the monotheistic articulation of that anxiety that you're talking about, that humans have always desired to kind of overcome limitations, if that's one religious expression, I would kind of, and this is maybe just my naivete at the moment and it's totally speculative, I think I would seek some type of religious expression that is the opposite of that. Maybe this is where like mysticism comes in, which is a wrestling with the negative rather than trying to actually overcome the negative through some type of, bridging of the divide or something like that. And I don't even know if that's possible, but that tension between the one, which might be, maybe we could call it biblical or Edenic or something like that. And I don't know what the other one would be, but maybe it's like a withdrawal, a complete rejection of. Maybe this is the indifference that you talk about in Baudrillard, right? Kind of like the indifference to the world that refuses to play the game of the algorithm or something along those lines. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so what you're saying? You're advocating that as a stance that we should take up, or that you think that?
Yeah, I kind of. And I have no idea why I feel like that's the best way, but I do have concerns. And I'm using the word pathology on purpose because I do feel like it is pathological that we desire perpetually to overcome finitude as we can supposedly seek the infinitude. But in so doing, we only induce further anxiety in ourselves. And if we build structures and systems that operate by like intensified rates of that pathologization, then the anxiety becomes even greater and greater and more extensive and more ubiquitous. And so then the question for me is, okay, how do you really find adjustment, to use a psychoanalytic term, within that pathological tendency? And I think for me, it has to be, some people would say you go through and maybe you come out on the other side. And then what I wonder is, or is it a break from that tendency altogether? And then I would just ask, what the fuck does that even mean? I don't know. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think if I was a clinician, I'd say, well, you just need to come into my clinic, and I'll just sort you out, and everything will be fine, and we'll talk
all for
about
the
your
low
symptoms.
price of $250 an hour.
Exactly. All you need is to come and see me 4 times a week, and I'll cure all of your problems and bankrupt you. But no, I'm joking. No offense, clinicians obviously love you.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, we love you guys. Do your thing.
We love you. Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. I don't know. The tension between the individual symptoms of the subject or symptom of the subject, and how to fit that into a society which basically is designed to keep you completely crazy and going mad and being unsatisfied and insecure and suicidal, is an impossible battle. I don't know, and I don't know what the answer is, but read Lacan, I say. That's usually
this is why I get so frustrated with popular politics today, because I think politics doesn't focus enough on theories of subjectivity. You know, this is, a lot of my work has been on Sartre. My book is on Sartre. And I think Sartre, I know that like Badiou's theory of subjectivity and of the event are heavily indebted to Sartre's work. He explicitly says so. And then there's like a Lacanian element as well in a lot of my work that I'm interested in. And then like post-subjective stuff like with Deleuze. But nevertheless, I think we need to wrestle with the theory of subjectivity, because if we don't, then I think we end up just stuck within this system that is trying to just perpetually produce anxious subjects.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that that is almost the central element of how the capitalist system pacifies subjects within its ambit, right? Like it's able to pacify us because we enjoy our exploitation. And I know that that's a shitty way to say it, but there's an element that needs to be understood. What does that mean to say that we enjoy our exploitation? Because obviously we don't. We're anxious, we're angry, we're pissed, we're taken to the streets, we're hopped up on opioids and antidepressants. So people aren't quote unquote happy, but that again is the different understanding of enjoyment. But we have to really wrestle with theories of subjectivity. And most, I think, popular politics, and I don't want to shit on them. I know I shit on them too much on the podcast, but like Jacobin and stuff like that, they don't wrestle with this enough. They I don't think they understand precisely what you said a minute ago, that we have a system that is trying to make us fucking crazy.
Yeah.
And that's how it operates. That's how it reproduces itself. And then we embody it, and we are complicit in the reproduction of our own anxiety.
Exactly.
And I think we should add that not only that, but if you don't take advantage of this time to analyze subjectivity, others will, right? And I think this kind of references back to, Isabel, you said earlier that, Jordan Peterson's like the daddy who's always in the back of your mind. And the reason is because at the very least, he notices that this has to be done.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And he does it in a kind of like folk psychological way. But that it's popular for a lot of especially young men because it's satisfying a certain need to, analyze interiority in this way. So if we don't do it, someone else is going to.
Exactly. And that's the danger with someone like Jordan Peterson, is because he's just about erudite enough to the ears of people who haven't got a clue to think, oh, this is somebody who knows what he's talking about. And he's really going to tell us something about humans and explain what's going on. And of course, then lots of people fall for it and then get convinced by his nonsense kind of theories that are just based on a complete bullshit. But the problem is that you're right. Is that there's no point in just having a sort of Marxist critique or a sort of critique of capitalism and a general leftist raging against, we're all being exploited and isn't the world terrible and evil, and without actually having a theory of subjectivity which implicates ourselves in this question, and how our own enjoyment is precisely part of the problem, and how it's not a question of like punishing ourselves in any sort of religious sense, but of recognizing that we are conflicted beings that live in a body which has all these different things going on and different kinds of demands upon us that are going to mean that we aren't ever able to act in a way that would be, according to the Kantian categorical imperative. We can't do that. We have to recognize what are these strange forces at work, which psychoanalysis goes into great detail to theorize about. But just on a general level, not everybody has to be a psychoanalyst or read philosophy or anything to sort of start thinking a bit more deeply about who you are as a subject and what your unconscious is saying to you, and to put it in sort of accessible terms of just actually understanding that there are things that form your personality and form you and drive your actions that aren't rational and are not necessarily always good, and most of the time they're probably bad, but that doesn't mean that you're an evil person, but you have to recognize them. And I think that's the first step towards any sort of proper use of psychoanalysis for like political theory, for example. You have to recognize what's really going on in the deep dark recesses,
Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent point for us to kind of stop now and maybe put an ellipsis and say, let's get you on again in the future, and hopefully we can you be our resident expert on psychoanalysis that we go to every once in a while?
With pleasure. Of course.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, now that you've said that, we'll be calling you every other week for...
Yeah, that's good.
No.
Do it.
No, that would
This
be great.
week in psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
That's right. With Isabel Millar.
Millar. Yeah.
That's right. No. Okay. Before we have you sign off, where can people find stuff that you've written, both popular and kind of academic stuff, and then I can post some stuff in the show notes below so that people can have access to some links.
Okay. So, I mean, I think for my sort of academic stuff, you'd find it on my academia page. But for sort of more blog type cultural analysis, you can find on Hysterics Discourse, which is my blog. So there's links to all my talks and papers and stuff there. But again, the sort of more theoretical, hardcore stuff is usually on the academia page. And I also have a YouTube channel, which is Hysterics Discourse as well, which has only got a few videos for now, but any other videos that I have will be on there.
Cool. That sounds great.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Isabel. It's been great.
It's been really good to talk to you, and I hope I didn't babble on too much, but I suppose that's why you got me on. So.
Oh, we encourage the babbling on this.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
That's our mode of discourse for sure.
Oh, fantastic.
That's the fifth mode, right? There's the
yeah.
the
mode
master,
of babble,
university,
exactly.
the hysteria, and then you've got the babbling.
The analyst, exactly, and then the babbling, exactly.
Perfect.
Got a day to discover you slaves getting paid, getting rich on days off.
All right, so thank you so much to Isabel for that great conversation. I'm really looking forward to having her on again and talking about psychoanalysis, maybe even more in depth rather than just more of the broader review that we went into, because Lord knows there's a whole lot of depth there to deal with.
Sounds good to me.
Let's go ahead and move on to our next segment, which is the sticky leaves. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing them jouissance in a possibly meaningless world. So, Austin, what are you enjoying this week?
This is how I become a new body, and I overcome the finitude, and I actually taste infinitude. I swim, motherfucker. I love swimming. Have I told you how much I love swimming?
Swimming is like going backwards in evolutionary time, dude. Not forwards.
Or am I becoming a dolphin? And maybe they're ahead of us in their societal evolutionary development. And so somehow I'm actually connected. There's actually this thing. It's called the mammalian dive reflex. Do you know about it?
No.
So it happens when humans, for example, humans, but it's not just humans. I think other mammals experience this as well. But when like water is splashed on your face, even all of a sudden your body goes into some sort of like alert mode, and it blood starts pumping to different extremities in different ways, and it alerts you and it wakes you up. That's why when you splash water on your face, it like wakes you up. It's not just like the temperature, but actually your body feels like it's going to drown almost, and so it signals this like crazy alert response, and it wakes you up and it charges you and it gets your body all alert. So that's only intensified.
So what you should do is put a gun in your mouth in the morning to wake up. That's what you're saying.
That will, yeah. I don't know what the mammalian bullet reflex. I have no idea what that is. The mammalian steel chamber. Yeah, I don't know what that is. But no. But so that's why when you dive in the water, or when you're, that instance of when you dive in the water, you feel alive, and it just wakens you up. I mean, unless you're terrified and petrified of swimming or something like that, or you're like anxious about getting your hair wet, or make it so that you can't enjoy the sensation. But that's what happens, is there's this sense of like freedom and opening up. So there is some like biological science behind it, but just beyond that, like I love swimming. My mom, when she was pregnant with me, she used to swim. As a child, I swam all the time. I was in pools like all day in the summer, and then at the beach in the summer, and then at the lake in the summer. So I was always around water, and I was always swimming. But it's been a while since I've actually not been in the ocean. I've done like body surfing and shit like that, but that's just like little bits here, and that's not actually just swimming proper. But before my lung collapsed, I had gotten into a habit where I was swimming about 3 or 4 times a week. And no, I don't think that's what triggered the collapse. I actually asked that. I thought I was like overexerting myself and working out too hard. That and the baby shark ab workout and other shit like that. I was like, did I cause this? And they were like, no. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Whenever I got out of the water, my mom is still a big time swimmer. I would actually call her, and I remember telling her, I was like, we would call each other most days, or we'd like text each other, and I'm like, oh, I went to the pool today and I swam X amount of laps, and then I drank my bone broth. Thanks, Mom. Like whatever, like that kind of shit, right? But I would tell her how great I felt when I got out of the pool because it felt like my lungs were open. I felt like a dog. Like I could breathe air from miles away and I could smell things better and my lungs were open. My lung capacity was open. And I felt alive after I would get out of doing like a good, even just like a 2-kilometer swim. And I was so into it before I had to go to the hospital. I actually went and I got those Speedo shorts. You know the ones I'm talking about? Not the Speedo like brief looking ones, but the short ones that look like bicycle pants.
Yeah, you would.
Oh yeah, dude. And check this out. I bought them Thursday night and I was so excited because Friday morning I was going to wake up and try my new Speedo shorts. And I figured I would be more like, not aerodynamic, water dynamic? But that I would be more hydrodynamic. Is that the thing? And then my fucking lung collapsed Friday morning and I didn't get to go swimming and I haven't been able to try these shorts yet. And I'm so excited that hopefully soon, I still have to wait a couple more weeks, but soon I will be able to get back into the pool and swim. And I'm actually really excited about just wearing my fucking Speedo shorts.
This is up there for the weirdest sticky leaves you've ever had, dude.
Oh gosh. But no, I fucking love swimming, man, and I want to talk about the benefits of it. I mean, it's an amazing workout. Obviously if you have trouble swimming, you might feel anxious about the idea of swimming, and I understand that. You can start slow, but honestly, it is the best workout you can get. It's really good on your joints, whereas running, for example, is really
right, yeah.
Running is really bad on your joints, like really bad. Like not even like, oh yeah, no, it's bad on your joints. Especially if you have an injury. I broke my femur when I was 19, and so my left leg is a little bit fucked up. Even still to this day. So swimming is one of those things that doesn't put any strain on my knee, which is fantastic. Beyond that, depending on what you're doing, but if you're doing the crawl, if you're doing the breaststroke, and especially if you're doing the butterfly, it is a full body workout. I'm talking back, arms, legs, core, lower back, upper back, shoulders, everything. And so it will tone you up and strengthen you at the same time because you also have the resistance of the water. So it's a resistance muscle exercise as well as an amazing cardio exercise that also doesn't put strain on your joints and your ligaments. Fucking swimming is absolutely amazing. And I swear to God, you will feel amazing when you get out, especially if you do a really good, heavy freestyle swim or butterfly or breaststroke swim. I mean, if you use a kickboard, you'll get it a little bit as well just because you still get a good exercise. But if your head is under the water and you are pushing yourself for a couple kilometers, I swear when you get out, your lungs will feel so open. It'll feel like you have 3 lungs rather than 2 lungs. And that's always a good workout when you feel like you have more lungs than you actually do. But yeah, I love swimming, man. And I've been so bummed because I haven't been able to do it since my surgery. Since I got sick, which was over a month ago now. And then, of course, I got my new tattoo, and you have to wait about 6 weeks because the chlorine will fuck with the color during the healing process. So I've still got a couple more weeks. But I did that on purpose. I didn't want to get my tattoo after I had totally healed from the hospital. So I actually probably rushed it. We talked about this in my shitty minute when I got a little bit of infection, probably because I rushed it. My body was not entirely healed and whatever. I put a little strain on the body, but so I still got to wait a couple more weeks for the tattoo to heal up, and then I'm going to get back in the water. So I can't fucking wait. I love swimming so much. So yeah, that's my sticky leaves. Swimming's great exercise. Do it.
You know what's amazing about swimming is you can do it and then not realize you're tired until you're done. Like after you get out, right? Like, is it just because when you run or do some sort of strenuous activity outside the water, your sweat warms you, right? And so it makes you kind of feel tired. But when you're in the water, you kind of stay the same temperature because of the surrounding water is kind of enveloping you. That you just don't get tired until you're done. Is that how it works?
There's got to be something to that, right? Because the whole point of sweat is to cool your body down, but it doesn't seem to do it well enough, right?
Yeah,
like,
the way that because the water temperature in the pool is going to stay the same and not be affected by your body temperature.
Yeah, Yeah. Like if you sweat a whole bunch, then maybe it'll cool your ass down. But that's why you got to like dunk yourself with water, and people splash water on their face when they have like a long workout, when they're playing ball for a really long time or they're running for a really long time. You squirt your water bottle on your face because that gives you that jolt of coolness that you need. But yeah, when you're in the pool, you don't overheat. So I think you're able to push yourself maybe a little bit harder, a little bit longer when you're in the pool. The real problem is that the breathing can be difficult. If you don't get your breathing right, then that can really fuck up your whole rhythm, and you won't be able to push yourself to the point where you're really getting a good cardio workout, right? Like you got to get your form right and your breathing right. There are great YouTube videos that can help you with that, but because if you don't get that right, then you kind of you feel like you're drowning, and then you get really exhausted really quickly, but it's just because you run out of breath. And yeah, so that can be the toughest thing. But yeah, in terms of I don't know, I can swim 2 kilometers, which is probably a more of a caloric, what would you say, like burns more calories than running a half a mile. But the fucking running a half a mile actually even sucks, and that's nothing. Running a half a mile, right? Mm-hmm. Like even 2 kilometers swimming is better than running a half a mile. Or at least it feels better. It feels less strenuous, I don't know why. That's interesting.
How long does it take you to swim 2 kilometers? That's a lot.
Yeah, it's about 20-ish minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. So not bad. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll rubber stamp your sticky leaves, man. Swimming is great. I mean, yeah, it definitely, like playing an instrument, the getting used to it and getting your rhythms down and making sure you're breathing right, it's difficult. But I've had a pool before, and once you get used to it and you get everything down, it's really, really great and invigorating workout.
Even if you just get around in the water and kind of fuck around, you're getting a good workout, right? Like you just go to the beach and you just play in the waves for an afternoon.
Pool basketball is one of the greatest sports that there is.
Dude, it's so hard.
It's amazing. You gotta go jungle ball style, right? Like no fouls, right?
Yeah, and then you got to play chicken, where you get like on top of each other, or on top of each other's shoulders and shit like that.
It's bad for your back, man. I ain't doing that shit.
Yeah, you got to get in deep enough water where there's no strain.
So you're underwater.
Yeah,
get that snorkel out.
You got to get a snorkel. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. So yeah, sticky leaves. So far, argan oil, honey on your face, bone broth, apple cider vinegar, swimming. What else have we talked about that's fitness, body, vanity related on this podcast?
That's just recently.
Yeah, that's just recently. Get a bidet. Troy taught me about the beauties of having a bidet in your house.
Oh yeah, man, that's my life, sticky leaves. Best $20 I ever spent in my life.
If you're a dude and you're getting older and you're getting hair in weird places, shave your nose. Get one of those little tiny trimmer things so it can get up in your nose and your ears. If you're a hairy dude in your chest and you got chest hair, make sure it's not coming out of the top of your shirt, unless it's like a button-down shirt, and then it's kind of hot, But if it's like a crew neck shirt and you got the little stuff, no, either tuck that shit in or trim it or something. Take care of it, I don't know. I'm just really excited someone's got to collate all of our like health, vanity, manscaping related sticky leaves, and then we can have a list and we can just promote that on our website.
That's okay. Don't do that.
Okay, don't do that. Yeah, please don't take the time to do that. All right, sweet. So we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode there. Thank you again to Isabel for coming on and talking with us about psychoanalysis, philosophy, etc., etc. Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. And then, of course, as a reminder, if you want to be able to recommend future episode topics, you can sign up at patreon.com/owlsatdawn and take part in the Democracy Motherfuckers tier. Or if you do the $5 a month tier, you get the Democracy Motherfuckers and the newsletter and access to all the bonus episodes. But go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn and get access or get information on how you can access all of that. What else admin-wise are we forgetting, Troy?
Y'all know where to find us. At owls_at_dawn on all the various Instas and Twitters and social medias and whatnot. You can find us at owlsatdawn.com if you want to leave comments for the episode and show notes and shit like that. Anything else?
I think that's pretty much it, unless there's anything else you gotta say.
Just one more thing I can think of, dude.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.